The year began without a promise. The year did not arrive with a trumpet blast or a sudden shift in the air. There were no fireworks lingering in the daylight, no great declarations written across the sky. It came the way most years did in America, quietly, almost apologetically, slipping in during the early morning hours while the nation slept. When people woke, they did not feel reborn. They felt resumed. Across the country, alarm clocks rang at familiar times. Kitchen lights flicked on in houses that looked the same as they had the week before. Coffee brewed, toast browned, and the weather report spoke in cautious tones about temperatures, not destiny. It was another year, and it made no promises. In office buildings from Boston to San Diego, custodians unlocked doors that had only been closed for a holiday pause. The carpet smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and the fluorescent lights hummed back to life with practiced indifference. Desks waited patiently, holding calendars that had been replaced but not yet trusted. Pens lay where they had been left. Paper trays stood ready to receive the same forms, the same memos, the same quiet ambitions. No one expected history to begin that morning. On the radio, voices returned like old neighbors, traffic updates, weather alerts, a familiar song that had already played too many times the year before. The announcers spoke cheerfully but not urgently. There was nothing to warn people about, nothing to prepare them for. The news felt measured, restrained, almost polite, carefully avoiding drama, carefully avoiding silence. In living rooms, radios filled the space between furniture. In cars, they accompanied commuters through intersections that obeyed the same rules they always had. Stoplights changed on schedule, crosswalk signals blinked their patient commands. America moved forward in an orderly fashion, unaware that this movement itself was the story. History, after all, rarely announces when it stretches its legs. Factories resumed their rhythm. Machines that had been still for a short while started again with familiar groans and vibrations. Workers returned to their stations, pulling on gloves, adjusting goggles, checking switches. The motions came back easily, as if they had never left. Muscle memory did most of the work. Conversations were brief and practical, about overtime, about the cold, about someone's cousin who hadn't shown up yet. Nobody spoke about the year ahead as if it might matter. In schools, hallways echoed again with footsteps and lockers slamming shut. Teachers stood at blackboards, chalk dust already collecting on their sleeves, reviewing lessons that had been planned long ago. Students stared out windows, counting minutes, thinking about lunch, about after-school plans, about nothing at all. The calendar on the wall showed a new year in bold numbers, but the day felt interchangeable with hundreds before it. This was how the nation began, without ceremony, without prophecy, without fear. In small towns, the pace was even slower. Stores reopened with handwritten signs removed from their windows. Clerks straightened shelves that had never truly been disturbed. The same customers arrived at the same times, exchanging the same greetings. "How are the holidays?" they asked, already knowing the answer. "Too short," someone replied, smiling without complaint. There was comfort in the repetition. Farmers stepped outside before dawn, boots crunching against frost-hardened ground. They checked fences, listened to animals stir, scanned skies that held no messages beyond weather. The land did not care what year it was. It asked only for attention, patience, and work. And so the work continued. In cities, buses filled with people holding briefcases, lunch pails, folded newspapers. No one spoke much. Faces reflected the quiet determination of those who believed that effort mattered, even if progress could not always be seen. The American habit of moving forward without knowing exactly why remained intact.
the year settled in. Newspapers landed on porches with soft thuds. Headlines spoke carefully, as if unwilling to raise their voices too early. Political debates simmered but did not boil. International events were mentioned, then set aside. There was nothing yet that demanded alarm. Editors chose words that suggested continuity, not disruption. Most readers skimmed, some folded the paper and left it untouched. Others read every word, hoping to feel informed, hoping information might offer reassurance. But the pages did not reveal much. They rarely did. At breakfast tables, families discussed schedules rather than futures. Who would be home late, who needed a ride, who forgot their gloves. The year ahead existed only as a series of small obligations, manageable and familiar. Televisions remained off in the mornings. There was no need for them yet. The day had already claimed its shape. In government buildings, files were opened, stamps pressed onto documents, signatures applied and practiced cursive. Bureaucracy resumed its quiet labor, sustaining the nation through forms and procedures that no one loved but everyone relied on. Progress happened here not in leaps, but in increments so small they could only be measured over time. Most Americans did not think about government at all that morning. That was, in a way, the point. The economy moved with restrained confidence. Money changed hands, but not dramatically. Paychecks arrived on schedule. Bills waited patiently. There was neither panic nor celebration, just balance, just continuation. It was an era that valued steadiness over spectacle. At lunch counters and cafeterias, people sat with coworkers they had known for years, discussing television shows, sports scores, neighborhood gossip. The conversations drifted easily, rarely touching anything that felt important. Serious matters were postponed for later or never discussed at all. There was an unspoken agreement that ordinary life was sufficient. And so the hours passed. Afternoons stretched in predictable patterns. Office clocks ticked audibly in quiet rooms. Sunlight shifted across walls and desks, marking time more reliably than any schedule. The nation breathed in and out, unaware of its own weight. By evening, headlights filled roads that led people back to familiar places. Houses glowed softly from within. Meals were prepared, eaten, cleaned away. Children completed homework. Adults loosened ties, removed shoes, sank into chairs that remembered their shape. Televisions flickered on now. News anchors spoke calmly, carefully. There were stories, but none that demanded sleeplessness. The world seemed large, but distant. America watched from the safety of its living rooms, confident that tomorrow would resemble today. And tomorrow did. The year made itself known not through change, but through persistence. Days stacked upon days. Weeks passed without markers. Holidays appeared and disappeared with ritual predictability. Seasons shifted gradually without announcement. No one marked the moment when the year truly began because it never felt like a beginning at all. Looking back, historians would search for meaning in these early days. They would analyze patterns, quote statistics, identify signals hidden in routine. They would argue that something was already happening, that the foundations of future change were quietly forming beneath the surface. But for those living it, the year remained ordinary. It was the year of open offices and humming radios, of resumed schedules and unchanged expectations, of history stretching its legs while the nation looked the other way. It was not a year that promised anything. And yet, like all years, it kept its own counsel.
Streets that remembered yesterday. Some streets never forget. They carry memory not in words, but in surface and shape. In the way bricks settle unevenly, in the cracks of sidewalks worn smooth by decades of footsteps, in storefront windows that reflect the present while holding the past just behind the glass. Across America, towns and cities woke each morning to streets that remembered yesterday, even when the people walking them did not. These streets were not monuments. They were not protected by plaques or surrounded by velvet ropes. They existed quietly, doing their work, allowing life to pass over them again and again. And in that repetition, they became archives. In older neighborhoods, brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces weathered by time and seasons. Some bricks were darker than others, stained by rain, smoke, or years of careless hands. Mortar lines softened, windows sagged slightly, doors no longer fit their frames the way they once had. But the buildings remained. They always did. People walked past them without looking up. The sidewalks told their own story. Concrete slabs rose and fell unevenly, lifted by roots from trees planted long before most residents were born. Gum stains marked places where someone had paused, waiting for a bus that no longer ran on that route. Chalk dust lingered faintly in corners from children's games, played generations apart, but always the same. Hopscotch squares, jump ropes, marbles lost and never recovered. In small towns, Main Street still followed the same curve it always had. The hardware store occupied the same corner it had for decades, even if the name above the door had changed. Inside, the floorboards creaked in familiar patterns. Regular customers knew which ones to avoid and which ones announced their presence. The bell above the door rang with a tired honesty. Diners sat like anchors at intersections, their chrome dulled but intact. Vinyl booths cracked but comfortable. Counter stools spun with a soft squeak that hadn't changed in years. Coffee was poured the same way it always had, strong, refilled without asking, carried in mugs thick enough to survive being dropped. Waitresses called customers hun or sweetie, not because it was written in a handbook, but because it had always been done that way. Men sat at the counter reading newspapers folded into familiar shapes. The same jokes were told, the same complaints were aired, the same silences were shared. Outside, the street waited. In cities, history layered itself vertically. New signs hung over old storefronts, renovated apartments rose above basements that still smelled faintly of coal dust or oil heat. Subway entrances led down into tunnels that had carried generations of workers beneath the same streets, day after day, year after year. Commuters descended without thought, trusting the infrastructure the way they trusted gravity. Street corners remembered protests long dispersed, parades long forgotten, arguments long resolved or abandoned. They remembered couples meeting, parting, promising, leaving. They remembered footsteps heavy with purpose and footsteps dragging with fatigue. They remembered everything, even when no one asked them to. In residential neighborhoods, houses stood in quiet rows, each with slight variations that revealed their age. Porches sagged just enough to show use. Railings were polished smooth by hands that had leaned there for decades, watching children play, watching neighbors pass, watching time move slowly. Mailboxes bore dents and scratches that no one bothered to fix. Doors held layers of paint and colors that marked eras rather than tastes. Inside, floor plans remained stubbornly unchanged, resisting modern efficiency in favor of familiarity. These homes were not frozen in time. They adapted, slowly, carefully, adding appliances, insulation, small improvements, but the bones stayed the same. Hallways still narrowed where they always had. Stairs still creaked on the third step from the bottom.
Families passed through these spaces like water through stone, shaping and reshaping them without ever fully erasing what came before. Old habits survived in these places too. Men still tipped their hats to women they did not know. Shopkeepers still kept mental tabs on regular customers' preferences. Neighbors still waved from across the street, even if they rarely spoke. The rituals of courtesy lingered, passed down not through instruction, but through observation. Children learned how to behave by watching, not by being told. In barber shops, conversations followed predictable rhythms: sports, weather, local politics, someone's son who had moved away. The chairs rotated slowly, mirrors reflected generations of the same faces, different hairlines, same expressions. Razors glided carefully, practiced hands doing what they had always done. Hair fell to the floor, swept away without ceremony. Churches stood quietly on corners and hills, the bells marking time in a way clocks no longer needed to. Congregations aged together. Pews bore the faint polish of countless services. Hymns were sung from memory, sometimes slightly out of tune, always with conviction. Faith here was less about revelation than continuity. Graveyards sat nearby, often unnoticed. Stones leaned gently, names softened by weather. Families passed these places daily, rarely stopping, comforted by the knowledge that those who came before had stayed close. The streets knew all of this. They knew which houses had once been fuller, louder, which storefronts had changed hands too many times, which corners were avoided at night, which routes children took to school, even when parents insisted on safer alternatives. They knew because they had been there. In industrial towns, abandoned factories stood like paused sentences, windows broken, walls tagged, machinery rusted but recognizable. People drove past without slowing, pretending not to see, but the streets remembered when whistles blew, when shifts changed, when the air smelled of labor rather than neglect. They remembered pride. In suburbs, memory felt newer but no less present. Cul-de-sacs held echoes of block parties, birthday celebrations, summer evenings when children roamed freely. Lawns were trimmed according to unwritten rules. Garages stored objects no longer used but not yet discarded. Change came here, but politely. Roads widened, traffic increased, but the underlying patterns remained. People still took the same routes, avoided the same shortcuts, trusted the same instincts. Across the nation, these streets carried Americans forward while gently pulling them backward. They shaped behavior, reinforced expectations, softened transitions. They made change feel slower than it was and continuity feel stronger than it might have been. History did not live in museums alone. It lived in pavement and brick, in diner booths and bus stops, in habits repeated without question. At night, streetlights cast familiar halos. Shadows fell in the same places. Windows glowed, then darkened. The streets rested, gathering strength for another day of remembering. By morning, they would be ready again, ready to carry footsteps, ready to hold silence, ready to remember yesterday, whether anyone asked them to or not.
Morning papers and unspoken fears. Every morning, before the nation fully woke, the papers arrived. They came folded and rolled, tucked beneath arms, slid across counters, tossed onto porches with a practiced motion. They landed softly on concrete steps, thudded gently against wooden doors, caught briefly in hedges before being retrieved. The paper was cool from the night air, faintly damp at the edges, smelling of ink and repetition. For decades, this had been the ritual.
and like all rituals, it carried meaning beyond its mechanics. In kitchens across America, newspapers were opened alongside coffee cups. Pages were smoothed, folded back, creased again. Headlines were scanned before the first sip. Some people read quickly, others slowly, but nearly everyone followed the same path, from the front page inward, from what mattered most to what mattered privately. The newspaper did not shout. It did not rush. It waited. Headlines were chosen carefully, large enough to command attention, restrained enough to avoid panic. Words were weighed not just for accuracy, but for tone. Editors understood something fundamental about the American morning. People wanted information, but not disturbance. They wanted to know, but they also wanted reassurance. So the news arrived with moderation. International tensions were framed as developments, not dangers. Economic shifts were described as adjustments. Political disagreements were portrayed as debates. Even tragedies were contained within columns, bordered by ads for appliances, groceries, and cars, reminders that life continued regardless. The layout itself was comforting. Familiar fonts, predictable sections, sports scores in their usual place, classifieds tucked near the back, advice columns waiting patiently for those who needed them. Order mattered. Local news sat beside national concerns, giving weight to the idea that what happened nearby mattered just as much as what happened far away. A school board decision might appear inches from a story about foreign affairs. A zoning dispute shared space with a report on distant conflict. Readers absorbed both with equal seriousness. Small-town papers carried a particular intimacy. They knew their audience personally, even if not by name. They announced births, weddings, funerals. They announced bake sales and church events. They noted who had traveled, who had fallen ill, who had returned home. These details mattered. They grounded people. They reassured readers that life, in all its ordinariness, remained intact. Yet beneath the calm surface, something else lived. In the spaces between headlines, in the careful phrasing of articles, in the stories that appeared again and again without resolution, there were hints of unease. Americans read them without always recognizing what they felt. Words like uncertainty, concern, and monitoring appeared more often than anyone noticed. Reports spoke of potential impact and ongoing discussions. Problems were acknowledged but rarely confronted directly. It was not deception, it was restraint. Editors understood their role not just as informers, but as stabilizers. They believed, sincerely, that panic helped no one, and so fear was managed, diluted, made palatable. Readers played their part. At breakfast tables, families discussed the paper selectively. They mentioned interesting facts, notable events, amusing anecdotes. They skipped the parts that felt heavy. Children listened without fully understanding. Adults filtered their concern through tone and omission. "What's going on in the world?" someone might ask. "Oh, the usual," came the reply. The usual was doing a lot of work. On commuter trains, newspapers were folded into compact rectangles, held carefully to avoid bothering neighbors. Pages rustled softly. Eyes moved left to right, line by line, trained by years of habit. Some articles were read thoroughly, others were skimmed, their essence absorbed without detail. Commuters learned which stories required attention and which could be ignored. They learned this not from instruction, but from repetition. Certain fears were acceptable. Inflation, taxes, crime statistics. These could be discussed openly, debated, complained about. They were familiar, manageable, safely abstract. Other fears remained unnamed. The possibility of decline, the fear of irrelevance, the sense that something fundamental might be shifting beneath the surface. These did not make good headlines. They were too vague, too unsettling, too difficult to frame within a column. So they lingered instead in tone. Advice columns offered quiet insight into the emotional landscape. Letters arrived from readers who struggled with dissatisfaction they could not articulate. They described unease in their marriages, boredom in their jobs, restlessness in their routines. The advice given was practical, gentle, conservative. Be patient, be grateful, things will improve. The columnists did not diagnose the nation, but they listened to it. Editorial pages reflected caution as well. Opinions were expressed, but rarely with urgency. Change was discussed as something to consider, not demand. The past was referenced often, the future vaguely. Progress was framed as gradual, almost accidental. Advertisements, too, told a story. They promised stability, better appliances, safer cars, more reliable products. They did not promise transformation. They offered improvement without disruption. Buy this and life will continue, but slightly smoother, slightly easier. Fear was not exploited. It was soothed. Even the language of disaster was restrained. Accidents occurred, incidents were investigated, causes were examined, solutions were proposed, but the underlying message remained the same. Systems functioned, authorities responded, order was restored. This mattered deeply to readers. In barbershops and diners, newspapers lay open on counters, pages smudged with fingerprints and coffee rings. Patrons commented on stories they had already read elsewhere, reaffirming their understanding through shared conversation. Did you see that article? Yeah, it doesn't sound good, but they're handling it. That last sentence appeared often, spoken with confidence rather than evidence. Handling it was a national comfort phrase. At work, newspapers were sometimes read discreetly, folded to avoid attention. Employers tolerated this small distraction, understanding its place in the rhythm of the day. A brief pause, a moment of connection to the wider world, then back to work. Evening editions offered updates, but rarely surprises. They confirmed what had already been sensed. They refined earlier reports, adjusted emphasis, added quotes. Rarely did they change the story's direction. Television would eventually take over this role, but the newspaper retained a particular authority. It felt permanent. It could be held, folded, saved. It demanded engagement, not just attention. And yet, for all its presence, it left much unsaid. Certain topics appeared less frequently than they might have. Certain patterns went unremarked. Certain questions were postponed indefinitely, not because they were forbidden, but because they were uncomfortable. The newspaper reflected the nation's emotional compromise, awareness without alarm, concern without confrontation. Late at night, after dishes were washed and lights dimmed, some readers returned to the paper. They reread articles they had skimmed earlier. They studied graphs, considered implications, lingered over paragraphs that felt heavier than they had that morning. These moments were private. In these quiet hours, fear surfaced briefly, without language. It appeared as a tightening in the chest, a pause before turning the page, a thought left unfinished. Then the paper was folded again, placed aside, and tomorrow was trusted to explain itself. In newsrooms, reporters worked long hours shaping the next day's edition. They chased stories, confirmed sources, argued over phrasing. They knew more than most, but not everything. They sensed shifts they could not yet prove. They suspected patterns they could not yet publish. They wrote carefully. Deadlines approached. Pages were finalized. The presses began their work, rolling ink onto paper with mechanical certainty. Thousands of identical copies emerged, carrying the same headlines, the same silences. Before dawn, delivery trucks rolled out, Bicycles followed. Footsteps echoed softly in sleeping neighborhoods. The papers arrived again. Morning would come, coffee would brew, pages would open. Americans would read what was printed and absorb what was not. They would worry quietly. They would trust cautiously.
Workdays that blended together. Morning arrived not as an event, but as a signal. It told millions of Americans it was time to move again. Alarm clocks rang in bedrooms that looked the same as they had the day before. The sound was rarely pleasant, but it was familiar, and familiarity made it bearable. Hands reached out without opening eyes, silencing the noise before it woke anyone else. The day began not with enthusiasm, but with acceptance. In kitchens, lights flicked on, coffee brewed, shoes were tied, lunches were packed with little variation, sandwiches wrapped in paper, fruit placed carefully beside them, thermoses filled to the same line every morning. These rituals did not feel important, but they were repeated with care because repetition itself had value. Work waited. Factories stood ready at the edges of towns and cities, their outlines dark against the early sky. Inside, machines slept lightly, prepared to wake at the same hour they always did. When the first workers arrived, doors opened with metallic echoes, and the day's rhythm began to assemble itself piece by piece. Belts started moving, switches were flipped, the air filled with sound, not chaos, but structure. Every noise belonged somewhere, every motion had a purpose. Workers took their positions, some standing, some seated, some moving constantly, others barely at all. Their tasks were specific, practiced, precise. Hands reached, pulled, tightened, checked. The work demanded attention, but not imagination. And for many, that was the appeal. Here, effort had boundaries. In offices, the pace was quieter, but no less steady. Elevators carried employees upward, depositing them on floors divided by cubicles and corridors. Desks waited with their familiar clutter. Papers stacked just so, pens aligned unconsciously, calendars marked with deadlines that felt both urgent and endless. Typewriters clacked, phones rang, conversations stayed low, professional, contained. Meetings were scheduled, notes were taken, decisions were deferred. Progress happened slowly, measured in memos and approvals rather than outcomes. Most office workers could not describe a single day in detail. They could describe weeks. The sameness was not accidental. It was designed. On farms, the workday followed older rules. The land dictated the schedule more than any clock. Sunrise mattered. Weather mattered. Seasons mattered. Farmers woke early not because they had to, but because they always had. Boots hit the floor. Jackets were pulled on. The air outside was cold or warm or wet, but never negotiable. Animals waited. Crops demanded attention. Fences needed checking. Here, repetition felt honest. The tasks changed slightly, feeding, planting, repairing, but the rhythm remained constant. Work was not something to escape. It was something to complete, one task at a time, with patience learned over generations. In schools, the day unfolded with predictable precision. Bells rang, hallways filled, classrooms settled. Teachers stood at the front, repeating lessons refined over years. Students listened, sometimes intently, sometimes not at all. Chalk squeaked across blackboards, pages turned, desks were scratched with initials carved long before current occupants arrived. Knowledge moved forward in small increments, rarely dramatic, often unnoticed. Education was not a moment, it was accumulation. Across the country, these workdays overlapped and aligned. Millions of Americans moved through similar hours without ever meeting. Their routines intersected indirectly,
in the products they made, the services they provided, the systems they maintained. The factory worker relied on the farmer relied on the office worker relied on the teacher. Each day blended into the next, not because nothing changed, but because change arrived quietly. Lunch breaks came and went. Workers ate quickly or slowly, alone or together, depending on custom and personality. Complaints rarely strayed far from safe topics: sports, weather, weekend plans. Complaints were mild, almost ritualistic. "I can't believe it's already Thursday. I swear the days are getting shorter." No one meant it literally, but everyone understood the feeling. Afternoons stretched. Fatigue settled in. Muscles ached. Minds wandered. The end of the day existed as a concept rather than a certainty. People watched clocks without acknowledging they were doing so. In factories, shifts ended with whistles or lights. Workers cleaned stations, logged hours, retrieved coats. They left together, carrying the smell of labor with them, leaving behind machines that would rest briefly before beginning again. In offices, evenings arrived less clearly. Work spilled beyond its boundaries. Papers were gathered. Lights were turned off one by one. Some stayed late out of necessity, others out of habit. Productivity blurred with presence. On farms, the day ended when the work allowed it. There was no whistle, no signal, just exhaustion and the fading light. In schools, students were released all at once, energy bursting forth into hallways and streets. Teachers stayed behind, grading papers, preparing lessons, ensuring continuity. These routines formed something larger than any individual effort. They formed reliability. Because the trains ran, because shelves stayed stocked, because classrooms opened on time, because paperwork was processed, America held together. Not through dramatic acts, but through consistency. Most workers did not think of themselves as essential. They thought of themselves as replaceable. They believed their absence would be noticed briefly, then forgotten. They were wrong. The nation depended on the blending of their days, on the predictability of effort, on the quiet agreement to show up again tomorrow. There were dreams, of course, promotions hoped for, raises imagined, new jobs considered, but these dreams existed at the edges of the workday, not its center. The center was repetition. Even discontent followed patterns. Workers complained in familiar ways, at familiar times, about familiar problems. There was comfort in knowing what bothered you. Radical dissatisfaction was rare. Stability discouraged it. By the time evening arrived, energy was spent. People returned home carrying the weight of their hours, setting it down carefully in entryways and kitchens. Work stayed behind, mostly. Tomorrow would bring it back. Televisions flickered on. Dinners were eaten. Homework was checked. Clothes were laid out for the next day. The cycle prepared itself. These workdays did not feel historic. They did not feel meaningful. They felt necessary. And they were. Because while leaders debated, while headlines shifted, while history waited for its moment, the nation was being held upright by people who did not expect recognition. Their days blended together so completely that years passed without clear markers. But in that blending, something durable formed. A backbone. One made of time cards and lesson plans, of harvest schedules and production quotas, of routines honored not because they inspired, but because they worked. This was the strength of ordinary labor, invisible, repetitive, uncelebrated. And without it, nothing else could stand.
The television glow in living rooms. Evening arrived gently in America, not with announcement, but with dimming light and softened sound. As the sun slipped behind rooftops and tree lines, living rooms began to glow. Lamps were switched on one by one. but it was the television that defined the hour. Its light was cooler, steadier, more authoritative. It filled spaces without asking permission, casting moving shadows across walls that had already seen generations of quieter evenings. Television did not demand attention the way radios once had. It did not require imagination. It offered images, complete, convincing, effortless. After long work days that blended together, Americans welcomed this ease. They sat down. They exhaled. They watched. The television set held a place of quiet importance in the home. It was arranged carefully, often at the center of the room, furniture angled toward it with deliberate acceptance. Chairs remembered bodies. Couches sagged slightly in familiar places. Coffee tables collected remote controls, magazines, and the small debris of daily life. Dinner plates were balanced on laps. Children were instructed to be quiet. Conversations faded naturally, without argument. The screen spoke now. News anchors appeared nightly, unchanged in posture and tone. They spoke calmly, clearly, confidently. Their faces became familiar in a way that felt personal, even intimate. Americans trusted these faces, not because they knew them, but because they appeared every evening without fail. Consistency bred comfort. The news did not rush, it flowed. Stories followed a familiar order. National matters first, then international updates, then weather, then something lighter to ease the transition into entertainment. The cadence was predictable, the transition smooth. Serious events were framed carefully. Words were chosen to inform without disturbing. Visuals were controlled, limited, restrained. Even images of unrest or disaster arrived softened by distance and commentary. Television did not lie, but it did not linger. Between segments, commercials appeared, bright, confident, reassuring. They promised cleaner kitchens, safer cars, happier families. Their tone suggested that problems were solvable, that improvement was always within reach, that life could be upgraded without being questioned. Buy this, choose that, everything will be fine. Families watched together, but rarely together in thought. Parents absorbed headlines, children focused on images. Teenagers drifted between rooms, half listening, half watching, already learning how to disengage while appearing present. Television taught this skill well. After the news came the programs, sitcoms with laugh tracks that told viewers when joy was appropriate, dramas with conflicts resolved neatly within the hour, westerns where good and bad were clearly marked, game shows that rewarded knowledge and luck in equal measure. These shows did not reflect real life, they replaced it. Living rooms across the nation filled with the same characters, the same voices, the same stories, week after week, season after season. Viewers grew attached. They learned rhythms. They anticipated jokes. They forgave inconsistencies. Television created a shared experience without requiring shared understanding. A family in Ohio watched the same program as a family in Arizona, yet their lives never intersected. Still, they laughed at the same moments. They felt tension at the same cliffhangers. They talked about the same episodes the next day at work or school. This was connection, simplified. As the evening progressed, attention softened. Viewers leaned back. Eyes grew heavy. The television continued, indifferent to engagement. It filled silence. It kept watch. Sometimes it was on without being watched at all. In many homes, the television served as a background noise, a substitute for conversation rather than a replacement for it. It spoke into rooms where no one replied. It narrated lives that had grown tired of explaining themselves.
Older Americans watched with particular devotion. They had lived through eras without screens, without images delivered instantly. For them, television felt miraculous. It brought the world into their homes without requiring travel or effort. Yet even they sensed something slipping. The images moved quickly, rarely pausing long enough to allow reflection. Stories began and ended within minutes. Context was implied, not explored. Complex realities were compressed into digestible segments. History passed through the screen, edited for time. Political speeches appeared in excerpts. Debates were summarized. Decisions were announced after they had already been made. Viewers felt informed even when they were not fully engaged. Television made participation feel optional. Children grew up with the screen as a constant presence. They learned its language before they learned to read. They understood pacing, tone, and emotional cues instinctively. They absorbed values indirectly through repetition rather than instruction. They learned what normal looked like by watching it portrayed. Even arguments in television families resolved quickly. Consequences were temporary. Tomorrow always arrived clean and uncomplicated. Reality was less forgiving. As the night deepened, programming shifted. Late-night hosts appeared, joking gently about the day's events, smoothing edges with humor. Their monologues suggested that nothing was too serious to laugh about, nothing too dangerous to survive. Laughter became a release valve. Meanwhile, real history continued elsewhere. Legislation passed quietly, economic pressures accumulated, social tensions simmered without resolution. Systems shifted incrementally, too slow to demand attention, too quickly to reverse. But the television showed only fragments. It showed moments, not movements, scenes, not structures. Viewers felt informed, but rarely compelled. Concern was diluted by entertainment. Fear was softened by familiarity. Urgency was postponed until tomorrow. And tomorrow always looked like tonight. In suburban homes, televisions glowed behind drawn curtains. In apartments, screens flickered against walls shared with strangers. In rural houses, antennas adjusted slightly, seeking clarity. Wherever there was electricity, there was television. It united the nation in posture, if not in purpose. Americans sat facing the same direction, watching the same light, absorbing the same filtered reality. They believed they were witnessing history. In truth, they were watching it pass. Occasionally something broke through, a shocking image, a tragic report, a moment that demanded attention. For a brief time, the living room grew quiet. Conversations paused, hearts tightened. But the next segment arrived. The schedule resumed. Normalcy returned. Television did not encourage dwelling. By the time the screen finally went dark, the day felt complete. Viewers rose slowly, stretching stiff limbs, turning off lamps, heading toward bedrooms. The glow faded, replaced by darkness and habit. Tomorrow would bring new images, new headlines, new familiar faces, and the cycle would continue. Television did not create indifference. It refined it. It taught Americans how to watch without acting, how to know without engaging, how to feel without responding. It became the silent narrator of American life, not shaping events, but framing them. In living rooms across the nation, history slipped by unnoticed, illuminated briefly before dissolving into static and sleep. The screen went dark, the room fell quiet, the nation rested. And somewhere beyond the television's reach, history kept moving, patient, persistent, waiting for a moment when it could no longer be ignored.
Politics, heard but rarely felt. Politics was everywhere and almost nowhere at the same time. It filled the air with words, speeches, promises, arguments, but rarely reached the ground where people stood. Americans heard it constantly through radios and televisions, through newspapers and conversations overheard in passing. Yet for most, it remained abstract, hovering above daily life like a distant weather system that might someday arrive but probably would not. Elections came and went with dependable regularity. Posters appeared on telephone poles, yard signs sprouted briefly on lawns, then vanished. Candidates shook hands in public places, smiling for cameras, speaking in practiced phrases that suggested urgency without demanding belief. People noticed, they listened, then they returned to their routines. Campaign seasons followed familiar patterns. There was the early speculation, the careful positioning, the slow accumulation of endorsements. There were debates framed as decisive moments, though few minds were truly changed. There were rallies that looked energetic on television, but felt remote to those watching from their living rooms. Politics, for most Americans, arrived as performance. Speeches were delivered in strong, confident voices. Words like freedom, security, opportunity, and future appeared often, arranged carefully to inspire agreement without requiring specificity. Applause lines were predictable. Pauses were intentional. The rhythm mattered more than the content. Viewers recognized this instinctively. They did not analyze policy details. They evaluated tone. They asked themselves whether a candidate sounded trustworthy, steady, familiar. They compared voices more than ideas. They assessed posture, confidence, calm. Politics became a matter of feeling, ironically, distant from feeling anything at all. In newspapers, political coverage occupied its designated space. Columns explained strategies, counted delegates, predicted outcomes. Analysts spoke with authority, drawing lines between events that most readers barely noticed. The language was technical, restrained, cautious. Articles described shifts and trends, but rarely urgency. They assumed engagement without demanding it. Readers skimmed. They knew the names, they recognized the faces, but the stakes felt unclear. Whoever won, work would still begin in the morning. Bills would still arrive. Children would still need rides to school. Life would go on. At dinner tables, politics appeared occasionally, then retreated. Someone mentioned a speech they had half-watched. Someone else expressed mild skepticism. Disagreements surfaced briefly, then softened. Nobody wanted an argument. There were dishes to wash, television programs to catch. Politics was important, but not that important. In workplaces, political conversations followed unspoken rules. They stayed general. They avoided extremes. Opinions were hinted at, not declared. It was safer that way. "I don't trust any of them," someone would say, signaling disengagement as wisdom. Heads nodded. This distance was not ignorance, it was fatigue. Americans had learned over time that political change was slow and uneven, that promises were flexible, that victories rarely felt like transformation. The gap between rhetoric and reality had become familiar enough to feel permanent. So people listened, but they did not lean forward. Voting itself was treated with quiet seriousness. On Election Day, people went to polling places before work or after dinner. They stood in modest lines, filled out ballots carefully, and left without ceremony. There were no parades, no declarations, just a sense of having completed a civic task. Results arrived later, announced calmly, often late at night. Winners gave speeches filled with gratitude and humility. Losers conceded with dignity. The system performed its ritual, orderly and contained. The next morning, America went back to work. Political shifts occurred incrementally. Laws changed, regulations adjusted, budgets were passed. These actions shaped the nation profoundly, but subtly. Their effects arrived slowly, distributed unevenly, difficult to trace directly to a single decision. People felt consequences without always recognizing causes. A factory closed, a school program ended, a tax rate shifted, a service changed.
These were experienced as personal inconveniences or local issues, not political outcomes. Politics remained distant by design and by habit. For many, the government existed as an abstraction, necessary, omnipresent, vaguely trustworthy, occasionally frustrating. It was something that ran, not something that lived among them. Bureaucracy buffered experience. Forms, offices, procedures, all of it softened impact. Decisions were filtered through layers of administration until they arrived stripped of drama. Stability depended on this distance. Televised political coverage reinforced it. Cameras focused on podiums and flags, not on consequences. Sound bites replaced explanations. Graphics summarized complexity into manageable shapes. The audience learned to absorb without questioning. Even moments of political tension were mediated. Protests appeared briefly on screen, contextualized, explained, minimized. Conflict was acknowledged but contained. Viewers were assured that processes existed, that systems would respond. Trust persisted, not because of evidence, but because alternatives felt worse. Older Americans remembered times when politics felt closer, more dangerous, more immediate. They remembered wars declared openly, sacrifices demanded explicitly. Compared to the present, the future felt calm, almost gentle. Younger Americans inherited this distance. They grew up watching politics as spectacle, not participation. They learned names and slogans, but not mechanisms. Engagement felt optional. The result was a nation politically informed, yet emotionally detached. This detachment was not apathy. It was accommodation. Americans had learned how to live with politics rather than inside it. They adjusted expectations downward. They focused on personal stability rather than collective vision. Dreams became private. Politics became background noise. Occasionally, something pierced the distance, a scandal, a crisis, a moment that felt different. For a brief time, attention sharpened, voices grew louder, opinions solidified. Then the moment passed. The system absorbed it. Coverage normalized. Life resumed. Politicians continued to speak. Citizens continued to listen. The exchange persisted without intimacy. History was being shaped, slowly, quietly, by decisions made in rooms most Americans would never enter. But because the effects were gradual, they felt natural, inevitable, unrelated to choice. Politics became something that happened to people, not with them. And yet the distance itself was a political condition. It allowed stability. It reduced conflict. It preserved routine. It made governance possible in a nation too large, too diverse, too busy to engage fully at once. This was the paradox. Politics mattered enormously. It just didn't feel like it. And so Americans listened to speeches while folding laundry. They watched debates while checking clocks. They read headlines between errands. They heard politics clearly. They felt it faintly. And in that space between sound and sensation, the nation continued forward, governed, organized, stable, without ever fully noticing how deeply politics shaped the ground beneath their feet.
Children of the in-between generation. They did not know they were growing up between things. For the children of this era, life felt ordinary in a way that was both comforting and invisible. They woke up in familiar rooms, ate familiar breakfasts, and walked familiar paths to school. Nothing about their days suggested transition or turning points. History did not announce itself to them. It passed quietly, leaving impressions rather than memories. These children belonged to an in-between generation, born after great upheavals before the next unmistakable shift. They inherited stability without understanding its fragility. Their world felt steady, predictable, and slow enough to trust. Mornings began with routines that shaped expectations long before beliefs formed. Clothes were laid out the night before. Shoes waited by doors. Backpacks held books that would be used again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The repetition was not dull to them. It was reassuring. Adults seemed confident. Institutions seemed permanent. The future seemed manageable. Schoolyards filled with voices and movement. Games were played without rules written down, enforced instead by memory and habit. Arguments ended quickly. Children learned early that most things resolved themselves if given enough time. Teachers stood at the front of classrooms, symbols of authority that rarely needed to be questioned. Lessons followed predictable patterns. History was taught as something already settled. Civics was explained as structure, not struggle. Children absorbed this without resistance. They learned that progress happened quietly, that systems worked, that adults were in control. They were taught to prepare rather than to challenge, to adapt rather than to disrupt. Television played a role here too. After school, children gathered around screens showing worlds that felt both distant and oddly instructive. Families on television resolved problems within half an hour. Conflicts had clear causes and clear solutions. Consequences were temporary. These stories did not match reality, but they shaped expectation. Children learned what success looked like by watching it portrayed. They learned what failure looked like too, often humorous, rarely permanent. The message was subtle but consistent. Life would smooth itself out. At dinner tables, children listened more than they spoke. Conversations revolved around work, schedules, and small inconveniences. Major events were mentioned briefly, then set aside. Adults did not shield children from reality so much as filter it. Worry existed, but it was quiet. Children sensed it in pauses, in tone, in the way adults read newspapers more carefully some days than others. They learned to read between lines without knowing they were doing so. They learned that some things were not discussed openly. This created a particular kind of awareness, not fear, but attentiveness. Play filled the hours between obligations. Bicycles leaned against fences. Baseballs bounced in empty lots. Sidewalks became racetracks, courts, stages. These spaces felt endless, even though they were bounded by streets children were told not to cross. Freedom existed within limits. Parents trusted neighborhoods in ways that would later feel impossible. Children roamed until dinner, returning home dirty, tired, and certain that the world beyond their block existed but did not yet require attention. Time moved slowly here. Summers stretched wide, unmarked by urgency. Days blended together in heat and light. Winters arrived predictably, bringing coats, snow days, and indoor boredom that felt temporary rather than oppressive. Seasons taught patience. Schools reinforced structure. Bells told children when to move, where to sit, when to speak. Authority was present, but rarely harsh. Expectations were clear. Do your work, behave yourself, plan for the future. The future, however, remained vague. Children were told they could become anything, but not urgently. Dreams were encouraged, but not examined. Ambition was something to think about later. For now, the goal was continuity. This created confidence without direction. As children grew older, subtle anxieties appeared. They noticed the gap between what they were told and what they observed. Adults worked hard, yet complained. Institutions seemed strong, yet occasionally failed. Promises were made, then quietly revised. These inconsistencies did not alarm them, they normalized them. The in-between generation learned flexibility. They learned to expect stability while preparing for disappointment. They learned that certainty was temporary,
but routine endured. Friendships formed deeply, anchored by shared time rather than shared ideology. Children bonded by proximity, not preference. They learned how to coexist before they learned how to choose. This skill would matter later. Cultural shifts brushed past them without fully landing. Music changed gradually. Fashion evolved subtly. Technology appeared without fanfare. New devices entered homes quietly, treated as conveniences rather than revolutions. Children adapted effortlessly. They learned new tools without abandoning old ones. They balanced novelty and tradition instinctively. They did not question whether change was good or bad. They accepted it as background. At night, bedrooms filled with sounds, radios playing softly, televisions murmuring down hallways, traffic humming outside. These noises became part of sleep, part of safety. Silence felt unfamiliar. Dreams formed in these conditions, dreams shaped less by ambition than by expectation. Children imagined futures that resembled the present, only improved. Better jobs, nicer homes, more comfort. They did not imagine collapse. They did not imagine upheaval. They imagined continuation. As adolescence approached, questions sharpened. Identity began to matter. Belonging became fragile. Children sensed that the world expected something from them, but did not yet specify what. This uncertainty produced caution rather than rebellion. The in-between generation learned to wait. They waited for instruction. They waited for opportunity. They waited for clarity. By the time they reached adulthood, many carried a quiet tension they could not name. They were prepared for stability, not disruption. They trusted systems, even as they suspected those systems might not always deliver. They believed in effort, but not in inevitability. History would later describe their childhoods as calm, even dull. But within that calm, values were being set, expectations were being formed, emotional habits were taking shape. These children learned how to live inside long stretches of eventlessness. They learned how to occupy time without demanding significance from it. They learned how to build lives without spectacle. They would become adults who valued steadiness over drama, endurance over expression. They would carry caution where others carried certainty. They were shaped not by what happened, but by what didn't. And when change eventually arrived, when history demanded attention rather than patience, they would respond not with shock, but with adjustment. They had been preparing without knowing it. They were children of the in-between generation. They grew up quietly. They learned slowly. They remembered more than they realized. And long after their childhoods ended, the era that shaped them would continue to speak through their fears, their hopes, and the careful way they learned to expect the future.
The slow economy and patient people. Money moved through America the way water moves through deep ground, slowly, quietly, and without spectacle. There were no floods and no droughts, just a steady seep that required patience to notice. Paychecks arrived on time, but they did not arrive large. Prices rose gently, almost politely. Debts existed, but they were manageable, spread thin across months and years. The economy did not excite, and it did not alarm. It simply persisted. For many Americans, this slowness became a way of life. Mornings began with budgets, unspoken but understood. Rent, a mortgage, utilities, groceries, gas. There was little left over, but there was enough. Enough became the standard by which success was measured. Not abundance, not expansion, just continuity. People learned how to wait. They waited for raises that came slowly, if at all. They waited for promotions that required time more than talent.
They waited for markets to improve, for interest rates to shift, for conditions to feel right. Ambition existed, but it learned restraint. This was not a culture of impatience, it was a culture of endurance. In factories and offices, wages inched forward. Cost of living adjustments appeared as small numbers that barely changed daily reality but offered reassurance. People studied their pay stubs carefully, calculating futures that remained vague. A dollar meant something here, not power, but stability. Families planned carefully. Big purchases were postponed. Cars were repaired rather than replaced. Appliances were used until they could no longer be coaxed into working. Homes accumulated signs of age, not because people preferred them, but because replacement required justification. Frugality was not celebrated, it was practiced. In small towns, money circulated locally, slowly, with memory attached to it. Shopkeepers knew which customers paid on time and which needed patience. Credit was extended quietly, without contracts, based on reputation rather than score. Trust filled the gaps where cash could not. Farmers felt the economy differently. They measured success in seasons, not quarters. A good harvest offset a bad year. A bad year demanded resilience. Loans were long-term, conversations longer. Here, patience was inherited. Markets fluctuated, but rarely violently. The absence of crisis created its own tension. People wondered quietly if this steadiness was permanent or temporary, but without clear signals, they adapted rather than questioned. The slow economy shaped behavior more than belief. People took jobs they did not love but respected. They stayed longer than they might have elsewhere. Loyalty was not sentimental, it was practical. Starting over was expensive. Careers unfolded gradually. Skills accumulated over time. Experience mattered more than brilliance. Success was defined by consistency. You showed up, you stayed, you endured. Banks reflected this rhythm. Branches stood solid and conservative. Loan officers spoke carefully, promising little, requiring patience. Mortgages stretched across decades. The future was not something to rush. Savings accounts grew slowly, imperceptibly. Interest compounded quietly. People checked balances occasionally, not obsessively. Wealth, such as it was something you waited for. Consumer culture existed, but it did not dominate. Advertising encouraged improvement, not reinvention. Buy better, not new. Upgrade, don't replace. The message aligned with reality. Ambition adapted to these conditions. Young adults dreamed cautiously. They imagined stability before success. They wanted homes before luxury, security before expression. Risk felt unnecessary, even irresponsible. This did not mean people lacked desire. It meant desire learned discipline. Entrepreneurs existed, but they were careful. Businesses expanded slowly. Failure was feared not for its embarrassment, but for its consequences. There was little margin for error. Communities understood this implicitly. They supported local ventures not out of romance, but out of recognition. Survival required mutual patience. Time itself became a currency. Waiting rooms filled, lines formed, applications were processed, approvals took weeks, sometimes months. Nobody was surprised. Speed was not expected. This waiting shaped temperament. Americans grew accustomed to delayed gratification. They saved for things. They planned. They accepted postponement as normal. When something arrived quickly, it felt suspicious. The slow economy also softened inequality without eliminating it. Differences existed, but they widened gently rather than explosively. Most people lived close enough to one another's circumstances to recognize themselves in others. This bred empathy, but also resignation. The idea of sudden transformation felt unrealistic. Change was imagined as incremental. Progress came in small steps, often unnoticed until years later. Politicians spoke of growth, but citizens thought in terms of balance. Expansion was desirable, but stability was essential. People feared collapse more than stagnation. so they held steady. At kitchen tables, finances were discussed quietly. Children overheard numbers without context, learned the language of caution early. "We'll see. Not right now. Maybe next year." These phrases shaped expectations. The slow economy rewarded patience, but tested hope. People learned how to live without momentum. They learned how to remain motivated without visible advancement. Some grew restless. Most adapted. Entertainment filled the gaps. Television, sports, hobbies, these provided stimulation where the economy did not. Life balanced itself through distraction. But beneath this calm, pressure accumulated. Not explosive pressure, but weight. The weight of deferred dreams, the weight of postponed decisions, the weight of futures that seemed perpetually just out of reach. People carried this weight quietly. They did not protest. They did not demand. They adjusted. This adjustment became a skill passed down unconsciously. Children learned it by watching adults navigate constraint with composure. They learned that endurance was a virtue. Hard times, when they came, would find a population already trained to wait. Looking back, historians would struggle to define this period economically. It lacked extremes. It resisted drama. It unfolded slowly, like erosion rather than earthquake. But for those living it, the slow economy was not abstract. It was present in every choice deferred, every ambition moderated, every expectation lowered just enough to remain realistic. It shaped character. Americans learned how to survive without acceleration, how to measure success without spectacle, how to live inside time rather than race against it. They became patient people. Not because patience was easy, but because it was necessary. And in that necessity, a quiet resilience formed, one that would not announce itself until tested.
Small towns, big silences. In small towns, silence was never empty. It lived in the space between buildings, in the pause before a reply, in the stretch of road where nothing changed for miles. It settled into porches and fields, lingered at the edge of conversations, and carried more meaning than words ever could. Rural America spoke softly, and often not at all. Change arrived late here. Sometimes it arrived already worn. The towns were shaped by distance, distance from cities, distance from power, distance from urgency. Roads led in and out, but rarely through. You came here on purpose, or you were born here and stayed. There was little in between. Main streets were short and familiar. A post office, a bank, a diner, a hardware store that smelled of dust and oil. Buildings stood low and sturdy, built to last rather than impress. Their signs faded gradually, never replaced until absolutely necessary. Nothing happened quickly. Mornings began early but quietly. Trucks started up in driveways. Screen doors opened and closed with the same creak they had made for decades. Coffee was poured in kitchens that faced fields rather than streets. The radio played softly. News arrived without urgency. In these towns, everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew of them. Names carried histories. Last names mattered. A family's reputation could stretch back generations, shaping how people were treated long before they spoke for themselves. Memory had weight here. Rumors traveled fast, but never loudly. They moved through nods, glances, half sentences. Information was shared indirectly, as if saying less made it truer. Did you hear about? I heard something. Well, you know how that goes. Details were not necessary. Everyone filled them in. Silence followed these exchanges, heavy but understood. Questions were not asked unless answers were wanted. Curiosity was tempered by caution. Privacy was respected not because it was sacred,
but because it was practical. In small towns, today's business became tomorrow's burden. Churches anchored the calendar. Sundays arrived predictably, marked by bells or habit. Congregations gathered not just to worship, but to observe. Attendance was noticed. Absence was noticed more. Faith was steady, unremarkable, woven into life rather than standing apart from it. Sermons emphasized endurance, humility, and order. Messages were familiar. Comfort came from repetition. After services, conversations lingered briefly, then dispersed. People returned home along the same routes they always took, carrying the same thoughts they arrived with. Farms stretched outward from the edges of town, fields dividing families by acres rather than fences. Work followed seasons, not schedules. The land demanded attention without explanation. Here, silence was functional. Farmers worked alone for long stretches, accompanied only by machines or animals. They learned to read weather, soil, and time without commentary. Words were used sparingly, reserved for necessity. A man could work beside another for years without knowing much about him. This was not unfriendly, it was respectful. Schools sat at the center of town life, both literally and figuratively. They educated children, but also unified families. Sports events filled bleachers. Performances drew crowds that recognized every face. Children grew up known, watched, and remembered. There was little room for reinvention. A mistake made young could follow someone into adulthood, carried forward through whispered recollection. This taught caution early. Young people learned how to behave by observing what happened to those who didn't. Consequences were rarely dramatic, but they were lasting. Disapproval settled quietly, but it stayed. Many left when they could. Those who stayed inherited silence. They learned its language, its boundaries, its protection. Silence allowed people to live without explanation. It softened conflict. It avoided confrontation. But it also hid things. Trouble existed here, as it did everywhere. It just learned how to remain unseen. Problems were handled privately, or not at all. Pain was endured quietly. Struggles were internalized. The town did not intervene unless absolutely necessary. Change, when it came, arrived through outsiders. A new business, a new family, a new idea. These were received politely, cautiously, observed over time. Trust was not immediate. It was earned slowly through consistency. Technology reached these towns gradually. New machines appeared alongside old ones. Televisions arrived but did not replace conversation. Radios remained on kitchen counters long before they disappeared elsewhere. Modernity was filtered. Young people watched the wider world through screens and wondered how much of it applied to them. Dreams formed that stretched beyond town limits, but often lacked clear direction. Leaving felt risky. Staying felt inevitable. At night, towns grew quiet early. Streets emptied, lights dimmed, the sky opened wide, stars visible in numbers city dwellers forgot existed. Silence deepened. In these hours, the town revealed itself most clearly. Houses settled. Wind moved through trees and fields. The absence of noise made space for thought. Some thoughts were comforting. Others were not. People lay awake considering choices they never voiced. Regrets remained unspoken. Hopes were tempered by realism. The future felt close and distant at the same time. Morning would come, and silence would retreat slightly, allowing routine to resume. Political conversations here were careful. Opinions existed, but shared selectively. People voted the way they always had, often without discussing why. Loyalty mattered more than ideology. Change in leadership did not feel transformative. Power was something that happened elsewhere. Economically, small towns existed in a delicate balance. Businesses survived through familiarity rather than innovation. Everyone knew which places struggled and which endured. Support was quiet. So was judgment. A failed business became a lesson rather than a tragedy. People noticed, nodded, moved on. There was little room for spectacle. This restraint shaped character. Residents learned to manage disappointment privately. They learned to carry disappointment without allowing it to define them. They learned to endure without demanding recognition. Big cities spoke loudly about progress. Small towns practiced survival. History, when it touched these places, did so indirectly. National events were felt as distant pressure, not immediate disruption. Wars were remembered through names on memorials. Economic shifts appeared as closed stores, not headlines. The town absorbed these changes quietly. Looking back, it would be easy to mistake this silence for emptiness. It was not. It was full of understanding, compromise, and memory. It held stories that were never written down. Silence here was not absence. It was agreement. An agreement to keep going, to mind one's own, to endure. Small towns did not resist history. They waited for it to pass, then adjusted what they needed to, slowly and without comment. In this way, they remained. Unchanged in appearance, altered in subtle ways. Quiet on the surface, heavy beneath it. Full of silences that spoke louder than words ever could.
Women holding the hours together. Time did not move on its own. In homes across America, it was carried, measured, folded, and passed along by women who understood its weight. Hours were not abstract units. They were tasks waiting to be completed, obligations overlapping, responsibilities that did not announce themselves but never disappeared. The day began before it officially started. Women woke early, not always because they wanted to, but because someone else needed to. Children stirred, husbands prepared for work, meals required planning, clothing required sorting. The household's rhythm depended on preparation done quietly, often before anyone noticed. Breakfast tables did not set themselves. These early hours belonged almost exclusively to women. The house was still, but work had already begun. Coffee brewed, lunches were assembled, schedules were reviewed mentally, rarely written down, but always remembered. Memory served as infrastructure. Many women held jobs outside the home. They moved between worlds, domestic and professional, without pause. They adjusted tone, appearance, and posture as they crossed thresholds. Their labor doubled, but recognition did not. Workplaces expected reliability without complication. Homes expected care without interruption. Women navigated both. In offices, factories, schools, and stores, women filled roles that demanded precision and patience. Secretaries managed information before it was valued. Nurses monitored bodies before medicine modernized. Teachers shaped futures quietly, one lesson at a time. Their work rarely made headlines. It made stability. After shifts ended, a second day began. Groceries needed purchasing, dinners needed cooking, children needed listening, elderly relatives needed checking on. There was no transition period. The hours stacked tightly, leaving little space for rest. Yet many women learned how to compress time, to multitask before the word existed, to move efficiently without appearing rushed. Fatigue was private. Social expectations shaped behavior as much as obligation.
Women were expected to maintain appearances, clean homes, polite children, emotional composure. Strain was hidden behind routine. Complaints were minimized. Exhaustion was normalized. Neighborhoods depended on this invisible labor. Women organized gatherings, maintained social ties, remembered birthdays, delivered meals in times of illness or loss. Community functioned through their attention. They knew who was struggling long before others did. This knowledge was rarely acknowledged. It existed as intuition, as awareness sharpened by observation. Women noticed changes in tone, posture, habit. They responded before problems became visible. This responsiveness kept systems functioning. In small towns and cities alike, women served as informal record keepers. They remembered family histories, social dynamics, unresolved tensions. They knew which conversations to avoid and which needed to happen. Silence, when necessary, was also their work. Marriage structured much of this labor. Roles were defined, though not always agreed upon. Women negotiated expectations daily, adjusting without formal discussion. Some accepted these roles. Some resented them. Most lived with them pragmatically. Choices were constrained by circumstance. Leaving was possible for some, unthinkable for others. Independence required resources, support, and risk tolerance that not everyone possessed. Ambition took quieter forms. Women pursued fulfillment in fragments through hobbies, friendships, volunteer work, or education taken slowly. Aspirations adapted to available time. Dreams were not abandoned, they were postponed. Children grew up surrounded by this labor without fully seeing it. Meals appeared, clothes were clean, problems were addressed before they escalated. Stability felt natural. Only later would some understand its cost. Generational patterns repeated. Daughters observed mothers, learning what was expected without being explicitly taught. Sons benefited from care without questioning its source. This continuity sustained itself. Yet change was present, slowly accumulating. More women entered the workforce, education expanded, conversations shifted, expectations loosened incrementally. But the hours still needed holding together. Women carried emotional labor as well as physical. They mediated conflicts, soothed anxieties, maintained relationships. They absorbed frustration so others could function. This work left little trace. Public recognition lagged behind reality. Cultural narratives celebrated progress, but daily life remained demanding. Women adapted without ceremony. Resilience was assumed. In moments of solitude, late at night, early in the morning, some women reflected on lives shaped by obligation. They considered paths not taken, possibilities deferred. These reflections were brief, contained, often interrupted. Time pressed forward. Despite this, satisfaction existed. Pride came from competence, from seeing systems work because of unseen effort. Women recognized their own importance even when others did not. They measured success differently. Community depended on this quiet strength. When crises occurred, women responded instinctively, organizing, supporting, sustaining. Their networks activated quickly, efficiently. They were prepared because they always had been. Looking back, history often overlooked these contributions. Records focused on visible events, public figures, formal power. The hours women held together left no monument, but they left continuity. They ensured that days followed one another without collapse, that children grew, that households functioned, that society maintained rhythm. Time moved forward because someone carried it. And more often than not, that someone was a woman, unnoticed, indispensable, holding the hours together.